Hello and welcome to the Film Comment Podcast. My name is Violet Lucca, and I'm the digital producer. After years of truly exhaustive research, David Bordwell has completed his book, Reinventing Hollywood, How 40s Filmmakers Changed Movie Storytelling. Combing through screenwriting manuals, personal correspondence, film reviews of the era, and more, Bordwell traces the evolution of techniques like flashbacks, voiceover, dreams, and different points of view, all of which came into widespread usage in the 40s. I spoke with Bordwell about this period of wild experimentation along with
Imogen Sarah Smith. I'm a writer for Film Comment, Criterion, author of several books.
Here's our conversation. I have to say it was such a thrill to read Reinventing Hollywood because it's so fun to read something that has a formal focus and not necessarily something that it's like Hollywood, the magical dream factory of several million people came together and manufactured these things of the 1940s. No, it's sort of talking about how in the 1940s, roughly 1939 to 1952, Hollywood spent more on A pictures instead of just filling slots with their Bs because people had more disposable income because of the war, and tracing these things like flashbacks, which in 1944 there were more flashbacks used in Hollywood movies than for all of the 1930s, which is crazy. And just sort of approaching those things that we kind of take for granted now, talking about like the necessity of this uneven distribution of information and how the development of these formal techniques was really just, they had these very practical purposes and for the purpose of telling a story, right? So I wanted to start by asking you, throughout the book, you address, the question of like auteurism within a system of multiple authors with these little interludes. And I guess, why did you decide to structure the book this way? Because it is interesting to sort of dive in deep into something like Amnesia and then go into, talking about Joseph L. Mankiewicz.
Exactly. Yeah. You really characterized the book well. It was an attempt to do something I hadn't seen people doing before, which is to look at not just certain genres or certain trends like, say, film noir, but rather to look at sort of a whole set of craft conventions that filmmakers had that they could draw on for really any genre or any trend. So, for instance, what you find when you think of film noir, okay, voiceover, flashbacks, problematic protagonists. But then you start to look at other genres and you find the same thing, that these techniques were pretty widespread and that people almost seem to be competing in ways to innovate within those techniques, almost in a kind of, if not a show-off-ish fashion, at least in a sense that they're making the movies for other filmmakers as much as they're making them for audiences, which I think does bring the auteur issue in, but in a way that maybe has not been emphasized as much. Plus, there are so many books on auteurs of the 40s, as there are genres of the 40s. It wasn't clear to me I could contribute a lot in that dimension, but I do think that we get a different perspective on the most significant filmmakers when we understand that sort of backdrop or let's say the menu that they're working with, the choices that they're making, so that we, one of the things that came interestingly out for me was that we think of Hitchcock and his films of the 40s very much as expressions of the Hitchcock vision of the world or whatever. But actually, in a way, Hitchcock has sort of set a certain standard for one of the genres, the thriller. And then he had to look around and see that other people are competing with him. And other people are turning out these, quote, Hitchcockian thrillers. And even the critics are calling them Hitchcockian thrillers. Right. And so what does the individual filmmaker do when suddenly they're in a race? A kind of escalation with these other filmmakers. And interestingly, Hitchcock tries to do different things. If you think about a film like Under Capricorn, or even a film like Rope or Lifeboat, you see him saying, okay, I'm not going to give people what they expect. I'll give them Notorious, but then I'm going to give them something else that I can tweak those other things with the Hitchcock touch. And of course, for him, it was partly a matter of setting himself, as you said, a very distinct formal problem. How do I make a movie in a single locale, or how do I make a movie with very, very long takes, as in Under Capricorn and Rope, and so on. So there's a sense in which I think we understand auteurism better when we see them, individual creators, in the context of what the creative options are that are themselves changing rapidly. I mean, one of the most exciting things to me about the 40s is that these things are just turning on a dime. I mean, people come out with Citizen Kane, and then every 2 years later, everybody is trying these various techniques. Not all from Citizen Kane, but certainly can be referenced to it. And the other thing I think that's important is that there's a lot of money to be made. In a way, and you touched on this, it was hard to lose money in the 40s with a film. It really was. They managed to do it by the end of the decade. They definitely managed to do it. And David O. Selznick probably did it better than anybody. But nevertheless, you could really just kind of pump this stuff out there, and the audience was happy to take it, which meant that you could try lots of different things. If you think of the great age of the B film is the 1940s, it's partly because B films had that kind of swagger. They could count on an audience, watching their movie. So to me, that whole context is so exciting because it puts auteurism in the frame of kind of competition, cooperation among these filmmakers, and trying to push the boundaries of what they can say and how they can say it.
Yeah, I have to say, I think with your approach in this book, it's one of the best accounts I've ever read of this kind of paradox of how did the Hollywood studio system, which seems in many ways, it's often compared to a factory. It's people talk about how formulaic films were, how, the moguls, the studio heads were so crass, and they didn't want to give any freedom to their craftspeople or their stars, and yet so many great films were made. And how did that happen? And by really delving into this idea of, okay, well, there were formulas, you can say, but they're really, as you say, these kind of menu options that people are playing with. They're taking all these different elements. And that also helps to kind of understand the problematic nature of writing in Hollywood, because, one of the things I love about your book is that it is totally focused on narrative and structuring mechanisms of films. So it's about writing, but as we all know, except for a few of the people who are really at the top of their game, few writers got to just write a script. It was passed around. It's hard to know who really deserves the credit. So your whole concept of cooperative competition and or competitive cooperation or however you put it, and this idea of everybody kind of having this big array of things they were playing with, helps us, I think, to understand how you get both the real sort of towering achievements of 40s films and also just such a kind of depth of good, worthwhile, watchable
interesting,
films.
intriguing, weird.
Yeah, exactly.
You said that better than I could, because there's a way in which all these options are mingling and mixing in ways that are completely unpredictable. It can show up in all kinds of ways. And as you say, the writing is important. It's one of the most interesting things for me in working on the book over about 8 years was I never really had worked much with filmmakers as writers before, or the writing side of directorial work, as would say Mankiewicz. But it became quite fascinating when I looked at scripts and script variants and things that were in our collection, and to see how much of this stuff is out there in popular culture, and is the writer is kind of the mediator between what's out there in, say, popular fiction or on the stage or radio, and then comes into films. I mean, a great example I find sitting right in our archive in Madison, Wisconsin, is the collection of Vera Asbury, who is a tremendous figure for the 40s. Very, very important, I think.
I am a big fan.
Yeah, now you're talking. She, she starts as a novelist. Laura was originally a play. She wrote it as a play and then couldn't get it produced. And so she wrote it as a novel, which was serialized, and she got a lot of money for it. And then wound up with a successful novel and then a film that was based on it. And then she started to write screenplays, which owe a lot to what she was doing in fiction. And she is one of many women who were writing at the time, mystery writers who wound up in Hollywood or had their works adapted for Hollywood. And they're transmitting all these different narrative strategies from what was essentially a new genre, the domestic thriller, the woman in peril movie, plot, I should say, and bringing those into Hollywood. So, for instance, we think of Hitchcock's Rebecca, but it's really Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, one of the best-selling books of the entire era. And that structure of the book wasn't completely retained in the film, but nevertheless, it set the tone for a whole range of narrative options that would come later. So there's a sense in which, for me, it was a real discovery, just as you said, of how important the writer is as a kind of intersection of all these different forces coming together, even though they're not usually given a lot of credit. for doing that. We think of the directors as the most important, but actually the writers are passing these stratagems of narrative down through into the studio system, and then the directors can build on them.
I also just have to say that the thoroughness of the book in terms of the number of films that you reference is truly awe-inspiring. I mean, as I was reading it, and the 40s is sort of one of my specialties. I think I know that decade pretty well. And every single time I would think, oh, what about this film? The next page, you would check that off. And
That's neat.
And it is really interesting the way that, as you say, you see these certain techniques existing across different genres in the way, all of these things, noir and these kind of supernatural films and ghost stories, but then, you see the same kind of thing starting to come into comedies and musicals, and that's really fascinating. And I love the fact that your book doesn't have a focus on a particular genre.
Yeah, that was important for me because it's been done so many times, and the depth is there in all those other and all that rest of that literature.
And I also, I appreciated that there was, in addition to the sheer volume of films, there are just so many different sources that you're drawing from to sort of back up your arguments, either, like screenwriting manuals, memoirs, things that critics were saying at the time, critics being like, the flashback is so hackneyed, the flashback plot is so hackneyed, and it's like fall of 1941. It's like, wait, what are you talking about? And they're like, what is this stupid fad gonna end? And then it's like, no, it sort of helps define the decade, which is so fascinating. But I wanted to ask, do you find that there was sort of thinking now about things maybe not included in the book, do you find that there is maybe a connection between these new or newish narrative techniques in film and the performance styles or, visual techniques that were, emerging in the decade too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And in fact, there are 3 or 4 different areas I just didn't get into. A couple of them I have worked on before, particularly visual style. In the 40s. I wrote about that in a couple of other books. And so I felt it would be not only redundant, but off target in a way. But 2 areas, I agree with you completely, should be covered, even though I'm not sure I couldn't bear to make that book any longer. And one of them is performance, which is so hard to discuss. There are critics who are good at describing performance, like Pauline Kael, but they're not necessarily good at analyzing it in the sense of the craft of the actor. They're very good at describing how it yields an impression for the audience, a kind of vivid account of what it looks like for Mitchum or Brando or whoever to act, but maybe not so much how they do it, the mechanics of it. And that interests me a lot, actually, more and more as I get older. So I did a little bit with this in a Criterion channel item that's coming up soon on brute force. It's coming out next week, actually. Again, Burt Lancaster in brute force, and try to break down his performance into kind of almost like Lev Kuleshov engineering, how did he move his eyes? How did he move his hand? How does he shift his shoulders? Things like that. So that interests me, but also something that I'm just too ignorant to write about, and that's music. Music is tremendously important in films of the 40s. And I have a colleague back at Wisconsin, Jeff Smith, who's very good on this, and he's writing about Hollywood scores in the 30s and 40s now. So I would expect he would have a lot to say about that. But there's a lot of good work on scoring in the 40s. So again, I felt it's kind of been covered, but in a way I should have said more about it, I think.
What really interests me about this question about what might be the intersection between narrative structures and performance styles is partly, the question of, did things like voiceover and these flashback structures lead actors or require actors to be acting in a different way, as well as something else you write about really well in the book, all the emphasis on subjectivity and psychology that came into 40s films, which is something I've thought a lot about and wrote a lot about, particularly in the context of noir. But I'd never really thought about this before, but, when I was just thinking about this before our conversation today, suddenly thought, that kind of impassive style that becomes very important in the 40s. I mean, that again, we associate mostly with noir, but appears in other ways, this kind of, everything being sort of internalized and this almost sort of sleepwalking, sort of dreamy style, makes a lot of sense if you're an actor and you know that there's actually going to be a voiceover, whether it's your voiceover or somebody else, describing some kind of interior subjective state. You don't really want to also be enacting that state with a lot of facial acting, or it would become very redundant.
Oh, I think that's really neat. I think that's a really neat idea and very true. I think what you find, I tried to characterize it a couple points, but again, I didn't really emphasize it probably enough. In a way, what you get with most 1930s performances, you might call behavioral acting, where everything is external. I'm not saying it's hammy necessarily, though it can be, but rather it's just a sense that you'd be able to just read off the characters' mental states, typically not just even through their face, because 30s actors really know how to use their bodies, the stance, the way they shift their weight, gesture, everything, necks, everything. But in the 40s, I completely agree with you. I think there is a kind of new interiority and a kind of neutralization of the acting performance that's intense, almost silent film style. And one of the themes of the book, as you know, is the idea that a lot of silent cinema comes back in the 40s.
Right.
But you think of Joan Crawford or almost any of the major actors, not so much Cary Grant maybe, but Stewart, for instance, and how these medium shots focusing on these actors with voiceovers or subjective monologues kinds of things. They don't have to do that much, but they're very intense. They're staring, and you're staring at them as you're hearing this. It's a different kind of relationship we have to the performer than we do with, say, Carole Lombard in 20th Century with John Barrymore, where everything is externalized.
Right. I mean, I'm often struck, particularly with Hollywood films of the early 30s, by the sense of it almost being like people don't have interior psychology. There's never that kind of focus on people's, internal states or their problems. It's, it's all about the world outside them. And then in the 40s, suddenly it's all about what's going on inside.
That's neat because it correlates the idea that in the 30s, you have almost a kind of social conditions mechanism for causal change. That is, what makes somebody a gangster or what makes a society girl?
Is sick or is neurotic.
That's right. It's
and
all
then in
out
the
there,
40s,
and you get infected.
Like people are isolated. There's no sense of them belonging to a larger society. But
and they're figuring it all out as they go through. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, I think.
Actors are also being called upon to, enact dreams. You talk also wonderfully about dream sequences, or to express, these different layers of time. I'm really interested in the depiction of time on film, and how, as an actor, do you do that flashback thing where you're going into somebody's memories? So,
no, I think that's right. There's a way in which even there's one strain that runs through the 40s that kind of continues the 30s behavioralism, I think. And you might think of it in terms of the ordinary films, and made by classic directors like Hawks or Ford, or even some of the Minnellis like Meet Me in St. Louis, where it's quite externalized. But then you get a performance like Judy Garland's in Meet Me in St. Louis, where suddenly it is completely interiorized. There's no flashback, there's no voiceover, but you're staring at this woman. You're watching someone think. How often do you get to watch somebody think in a 1930s film? And so that sense, I think you're right on target with that. There's a way in which, by the 40s, they're rethinking narrative and thinking, okay, if we have subjective narratives, then we've got these very sensitive vessels, these characters who are really quite alert to all kinds of things in their environment. Maybe we can downplay traditional acting gestures and so forth, and just let the audience soak that in, soak that quality of their thoughtfulness or their fear or whatever that emotion is in a very intimate kind of way. I think that is tied to it. And in fact, it does, then you have these sort of superstructures like memory, flashbacks and fantasies and things like that, kind of just reinforcing that interiority.
You talk a lot about how these techniques are now very threaded into, contemporary filmmaking in an interesting way. I mean, have you seen Zama?
I have seen Zama.
Okay. And because I think Zama brings up an interesting question, because it's sort of I feel like all of Lucretia Martel's films do this, but she's really pushing on the limits of, it's very psychological, it's very subjective, but also pushing at the limits of narrative confusion.
Yeah.
And I guess
it's a film that needs voiceovers but doesn't have them.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's right. I think you're right. There's one way to look at it and say, the Tarantinos and the others have so assimilated these techniques. I mean, not even just them, ordinary cinema. I mean, you go see anything now and it's going to have flashbacks.
Yeah.
It's going to have voiceovers. It's going to have all these things that in the 40s were kind of new. But when you get to films that sort of say, okay, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to be more behavioral. Like, say, the Meyerowitz stories, which is trying for something like that more 30s, I think. Detachment, not really, you're observing the characters and trying to figure them out. And though there are some identification processes probably going on, it's still pretty much detached. And you find that filmmakers are kind of forswearing that, as Martel does. That's pretty interesting too. Though, of course, The Headless Woman is I've never tried to work it out, but I'm pretty convinced that's a flashback movie or something like that.
Yeah. No, the period that you write about, you see that there is this real attempt to push things forward in a way that, and break new ground. And then, as you also point out, sort of gentlemanly competition, let's say, between
they're
these.
rushing on this stuff. Clearly,
exactly.
They're completely enjoying this. And we have to never forget, a lot of these are young people.
Exactly.
These are, Wells is the prototype, of course. You've got the old guys like Hawks and Ford and to some extent Hitchcock, but a lot of these are young filmmakers. Not necessarily auteurs for us today, but Minnelli or someone like that. And they're all like picking this stuff up right away because they all want to advance in their careers. They want to make films that are interesting. They are seeing everything. One of the most astonishing things I found watching, going back through Hollywood Reporter and Variety, was these people really went to the movies. I mean, we think that kids today the filmmakers anyway, are cinephiliacs. But these people saw movies every night. They went to premieres. They had screenings for themselves in the day at the studio, and they would go to people's houses at night, where it turns out, and this is something I'd love to write about if I could find more data, producers could borrow pictures from rival studios and show them in their homes at night at no charge. They just have to pay their projectionists and so on. But they just get these things shipped to them. It's just like, again, competitive cooperation, seeing what your competition is up to. So these people are just soaking in movies. Not all of them. I mean, Ford, I don't think was. But a lot of them were. Dory Sherry saw a movie almost every night. And they're constantly plucking these ideas, I think, from each other, trying to tweak them and spin them, just as people do nowadays when they see something on cable and say, I could do that, but I could do it differently,
Yeah.
So it's this kind of crazy immersion that they had in their own film culture. And of course, the war isolated them that way. I mean, there really wasn't much else to do. Hollywood was still a fairly small city, and basically they could drink, they could screw each other, and they could, go to the movies.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask, as like, you briefly mentioned seeing something on cable and then maybe doing it better in a film. I guess maybe you could speak to this better than I could, but just the sense of like, do you have that sense of like friendly competition or sort of like trying to push things forward now, or sort of like trying to outdo now, or not really?
I think among certain filmmakers it's there. It has been there, certainly among the Boys Club filmmakers. I mean, clearly De Palma, Scorsese, that group, they're trying. I mean, the famous examples are with the Steadicam. How long can you make this take? So we have Snake Eyes, which is one of the earliest uses of digital compositing to enhance the length of a take. And we won't go necessarily where that implies, but basically they're clearly competing with each other in that narrow sense. But I think more generally, you think of that scene in The Player where the Tim Robbins character is being pitched all these different stories, and again, it's a switcheroo scene because it's Out of Africa meets Pretty Woman, that sort of thing. But then at one point, someone describes the scene to him and he says, I haven't seen that before. I mean, there's a sense in which not all of the moguls, but many were kind of connoisseurs of what worked and what didn't work, and they had good memories. Zanuck, who emerges for me and is one of the heroes of my research, Zanuck was a man who clearly breathed and slept movies. After he was full days working on films, he went home at night and watched movies and showed them to his employees. And this guy would say, well, we could do this, or we could do that, or we could do that. And clearly he's like stealing things from all these different films and playing with the possibilities. We might have had in Laura a scene where Dana Andrews goes to the movies and sees actresses on the screen, all of whom are Laura. So clearly they're constantly playing with this. They're movie crazy.
Yeah, I like the way you brought that out, because when we think of a lot of filmmakers today, we're very aware of them drawing, being lovers of old movies and drawing from things and doing obvious sort of homages to older films, and we don't tend to think of filmmakers of the 40s doing that. But as you point out, it really was a decade in which that was really, the idea of studying film and watching older films and so forth really was kind of taking off. And you do see people who are still, hearkening back to silent films, that they'd seen, or and then also you bring up a lot of examples of the way they would embed these in-jokes, references to their own films or other films of the time, and, oh, you look like that guy in the movies, Ralph Bellamy, and that kind of, those kind of moments that are wonderful because they convey this sense of the expectation that an entire society would have seen these movies. You could expect that everyone would get these, or at least enough people would get the jokes to make them worth making. I don't know if there's that same expectation now that you can have, given that, everybody's going to know this film.
Exactly. I mean, that's what, because it's like what the, it seemed back then the cultural reference, the scope of it was a little bit more narrow or a little bit better defined. And now there's just an explosion of so many different references you could possibly make. And it's like, I remember having a conversation online with somebody who didn't realize that Dr. Hibbert on The Simpsons was a parody of Bill Cosby in The Cosby Show. But it's like that. It's like that's insane that someone would not get that reference. Right. but obviously, but then it's also a little deeper because The Simpsons was totally reacting against The Cosby Show and undoing sort of like the nice family drama, family sitcom. And so it's like now it feels very. I feel like, except for maybe like The Simpsons, there is no like media lingua franca for people to really build off of unless it's very specialized and you're in like a meme group talking about a very specific thing.
The only example I can think of that's an interesting point, because most of those references, I think you're right, are really for film geeks, for otaku. Mm-hmm. But the one I would think of offhand is in one of the Ocean's 11 films. Do you remember that there's this whole business where Tess, played by Julia Roberts, is actually pretending to be Julia Roberts.
Yes.
Is it 12? Ocean's 12? One of those. Anyway, the thing is, and then Bruce Willis is in a hotel lobby and she walks by and he says, "Oh, Julia," and then he starts talking about how some film, he talks about how, don't anybody tell me that they knew I was dead already, so there's a reference to, The Sixth Sense and so on. And that's the only one I can think of where they really seem, but it's Soderbergh, a clear movie geek, doing this, but he seemed to be clearly assuming the audience would pick up on the star persona, like with the Ralph Bellamy reference, but also a specific movie. Mm-hmm. And even he talks about box office figures in that scene. Yes. So, I mean, there's a way in which that may extend beyond the sort of the narrow realm, but I think you're right. I think that kind of movie, but also I think what we have now might have been there in the 40s too, which is this layered audience where, okay, who cares if the Hicks and the Sticks don't get this, really? I mean, come on, we're not making movies for them. And and then maybe the sophisticates in New York, a couple of critics will go, "Oh, you guys are playing around again." But it's also for our friends in Hollywood. Did you see what just did? Yeah. For instance, I mean, there's an Orson Welles radio program where he has a psychiatrist who's kind of crazy, and his name is Herman Mankiewicz. I mean, in the radio show. So I mean, how many people are going to get that? But on the other hand, clearly back home, they're all going, "Oh, Orson stuck it to Herman Mankiewicz."
I would like to return to the question of pushing narrative confusion and playing with time. I'm curious because you wrote a very interesting piece about Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. Have you seen The Snowman? Because that's getting
Can't wait. Got to see it.
Okay.
Got to see it. Any movie that gets those reviews, I got to see.
Okay. But I mean, I guess in terms of like films that are super recently confusing in a way that's not necessarily pushing the form forward and they're just sort of a failure to contain vital narrative information. What is one that you find interesting or sort of like, I see what they were trying to do and they kind of failed?
No, I have a chapter, kind of innovation by accident,
right.
and it's about exactly this, I think, which is how they're trying for lots of different things, but it didn't gel, and maybe there are these conflicting impulses, and the result was this kind of mess that you don't understand it. And my favorite is that film, The Chase, where I defy you to figure that film out, and yet it's completely captivating, to me anyway, because it's such a crazy mixture of elements. And I finally wound up finding a script for it and trying to track down on the blog, not in my book, but a series of blogs that I think only 9 people bothered to look at. But that this thing was a complete mess at the level of production. And so this happens from time to time where it's even there in Laura. There are incompatibilities in Laura that are due to the changes in production. And in a way, I mean, the one side of that is, okay, it's a failure. Artistically, it's a failure. But on the other hand, but in a way, these glitches kind of become interesting and something that people can work on productively. If you think of somebody like David Lynch, these are the kinds of incompatibilities that his work is built on.
Right,
I mean, the Red Room, what are the rules here? I don't understand the rules.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we think, especially of old Hollywood, we always assume that they really believed that everything had to be clear, and you didn't want to confuse your audience. And you quote several times from critics, who are sort of passing judgment on saying, well, this was too confusing. Audiences are not going to get this. And again, going back to film noir, which is unavoidable for me. But there are a lot of those. I mean, I have never found anybody who could explain Lady from Shanghai to me, which I cannot follow for the life of me. And I think of myself, again, a film that was a mess in production, and maybe if it hadn't been edited the way it was, maybe something just got. And I mean, Robert Mitchum would joke during the making of Out of the Past, which actually is a film that I think is possible to follow, but he would say, don't tell anybody, but I think they lost a few pages in Mimeo. That even the actors and people always talk about The Big Sleep and the idea that nobody knew who had committed one of the murders. That with noir, in a sense, though, confusion and anxiety are sort of part of what they are trying to evoke. And so it becomes a question of, at what point is confusion, mean failure?
Right.
And at what point is it actually, a satisfying or
takes
effective,
it to another level anyway.
Takes it to another level in a way. And film, I like The Chase a lot. And of course, like so many of those films, it's about a kind of damaged veteran, somebody who has amnesia. And so that the sense of confusion is sort of putting you into his inability to, understand the world in a coherent way. So,
but it also makes for a film that is so elliptical in many ways. No, I think you're right. I think that what's interesting about a lot of these films is that they could be made more clear. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you go back to The Big Sleep, say, there's a way to tell that story in a clear fashion. It's just that Howard Hawks is not interested in this, and Lee Brackett was not. And Lee Brackett, I mean, Hawks is like, have 3 good scenes and don't annoy the audience, and you're set. But there's a sense in which also, in trying to build those plots, they avoided the things that would have made their work easier. So, for instance, a classic case with something like The Big Sleep is that you would embed flashbacks to exactly what Carmen did, exactly what, you have whole characters who are mentioned all the way through and are never shown, mm-hmm. Well, okay, let's show some of them and so on. And it could be made, quote, clearer, but Hawks didn't, and Lee Brackett presumably didn't want to do that.
Chandler himself didn't care about plot.
Because the way he made his books,
It wasn't like he couldn't write a clear plot. It was that was not what he was interested in.
Well, and also he was splicing together short stories to make his novels, which makes for
that
disparities.
Strange episodic quality. But I mean, I'm really interested in the ways that these chronological structures, the ways that the films are treating time structurally, are also making that time in some of these films is also the subject.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
And I feel like with a lot of the greatest movies of the 40s, think about both Citizen Kane and Magnificent Ambersons and How Green Was My Valley. There are all these films that are about the experience of time. The 40s just seems so obsessed with the past, the idea of, the constant pull of the past, or this overwhelming feeling of kind of regret and loss. And, they're using these structures to convey a certain feeling about time, and the use of, ellipses can also be a way. I mean, not a Hollywood film, although I think you do reference it. The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, one of my favorite films of the decade, that's really a film about time that constantly just leaves out the most important scenes. Like, you don't actually see things happen, and it keeps coming back after something important has happened, and the sort of cumulative effect of that is this kind of sense of loss.
This is Amberson's again, too.
Amberson's, absolutely.
No, this is fascinating, and it touches on something that I want to do more with. It's a little bit in the book, but I want to develop it more. And that is the idea that, again, speaking roughly, 30 cinema is theatrical in a certain way, because it's about behavior that can be displayed, interactions that can be shown. 40 cinema becomes, in many respects, not completely, but exactly the way you're talking about it, becomes more novelistic. It's more, many of these films are trying for that density of present, past, future that we get in novels. You see it in films like, well, obviously in Amberson's, which the Henry Jamesian kind of quality to these films, where there's almost a sense that there's something that's happened here that we're not going to see, but we're going to see everybody react to. But you get it also, I think, in films where you don't expect it. I think you get it, for instance, in one of my favorites of the 40s, which is Daisy Kenyon.
Ooh, me too.
Where I mean, I'm looking back at my book, because I've been afraid to read it, actually. I went back and looked at it today, and I have all this stuff on Daisy Kenyon. I thought,
Yes,
what made me do
you have
this?
a long discussion of that.
But the thing is, it's because you can't figure these people out. What the hell is wrong with these people? I mean, there's not a sane one in the bunch, you know? And they're contradictory from scene to scene. It's not just Henry Fonda. He's not just a wounded vet. Daisy's crazy, and the Dana Andrews character's crazy. I mean, they're all kind of nuts on each other, and you're trying to figure out, what do these people want? What are they trying to do to each other? And it's all those kinds of stratagems and cross purposes you get in a novel. And by the way, these are not in the novel. The Elizabeth Janeway novel does not do this.
Absolutely breaking the rules about, characters having clear motivations, having somebody who's clearly sympathetic, whom you identify with. There's really everyone in the film is really ambivalent, really screwed up,
And to me, this is not Eugene O'Neill's psychodrama. This is really like a novel that's trying to probe these very, and partially seen. I mean, this is where, as you say, narrative structure and narration come in. Because if we had a single protagonist, if it was all about Daisy and we only saw Daisy all the time, then we'd understand it. But we don't. We're skipping among these three characters and getting glimpses of what they do. And to try to assemble these pieces of their actions into a coherent whole is very difficult.
And it's also about the performance style, too. I mean, all those performances are great. And they're all actors who are totally capable of being ambiguous and ambivalent and evoking these contradictory responses from you, where Dana Andrews is so charming and at the same time he's so sleazy and
honey bunch. What does that come from? Calling everybody honey bunch, what does that mean? But you're right about, to go back to your original point, that is, and there's always something about the past in these things. There are past relationships or things that are skipped over, like Daisy suddenly marries the Henry Fonda character. Why? It happens off screen. It's gone. Now, maybe it's one of those things that gets elided because of production circumstances or whatever, but the result is still very interesting, more interesting than if we'd had a lot of internal explanation. Again, the denial of voiceover is important in that film, too. So, I mean, there's a way in which, exactly what you're saying about this time thing, it springs out of, I think, what we think of as, quote, novelistic traits, like characterization, depth, a multiplicity of viewpoints, a certain critical relationship on the part of the reader, viewer, to what's happening. Those things emerge more saliently in the 40s.
And Daisy Kenyon is also, interestingly, kind of like the culmination of these 4 films that Preminger made with Dana Andrews, all of which are really interesting, all of which, have, and you talk about a couple of them and the ways that, somewhere late in the film you find out something about the main character, or, he has this moment where he tells you about his life and suddenly you kind of understand him.
Fallen Angel's great.
Better.
Way.
Fallen Angel has that, where again, he's playing this very mixed kind of character. And Fallen Angel is actually a good segue to also just mention the way you talk about how mystery became just everywhere in 40s films, and is another thing that even in films that were not per se a mystery or a thriller, these techniques, with a flashback, if you open a movie with a flashback, you're immediately going, okay, how did we get here? And then it becomes this mystery to find out, what the backstory is. And so everything is suddenly doing that thing of trying to evoke a question in your mind. And again, it's something that 30s cinema generally doesn't do. It's very much, happening in the present.
It's linear,
and,
Yeah. And what's also interesting about that is how if you present, you mentioned the hindsight bias, and that if you allow the audience to sort of figure it out, their mind will fill those things in. Like, you don't actually need to show this needless exposition. You can just rely on the fact that, unlike one of my least favorite things is like, suspension of disbelief. No, people are always thinking when they're watching films. And the flashback structure is a great way to sort of expediently get to certain things or create a sense of suspense, even in, pretty mundane things that should be utterly mundane. Yeah.
This is what I love about this because, for instance, you take the problem of coincidence. If you're a writer, you've got to motivate it. The characters have got to meet sooner or later. Well, to have them meet at a certain point can look artificial. The more your movie goes on, the later and later they meet, it looks more and more forced to have them meet. So, on the other hand, if you flash back to their meeting from a later point in the story, no problem, because they met, right?
Exactly.
We know they met,
Yes.
So it can be the most arbitrary thing. I mean, I love the way in which flashbacks can cover so much. And it was fascinating to go back and look, as you say, at those screenplay manuals and in the magazines that people, for some reason, never looked at before, I think. The Writer and Writer's Digest, where screenwriters are telling people, here's what you do when you write mystery fiction or when you write a movie script and so on. Publishers Weekly even had articles about this. And they're saying things like, here's what you do. Here's how you do it. And use a flashback if you have to. And some writers are saying, no, flashbacks are lazy. Voiceover is lazy. All this stuff. You got to tell your story straightforwardly. And people are saying, we don't care. We'll just keep doing it.
Yeah.
No, it's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, voiceover, is something that I very much feel can be good or bad. And a lot of people, even who love 40s films, are really put off by those omniscient kind of stentorian voice of, the Reed Hadley kind of voice of God narration. It does at times become very heavy-handed, which is something, I think we associate it with the 40s. I've certainly seen recent films that I felt really had a heavy-handed use of narration that just excessively kind of told you exactly, what this movie is about to make sure you're not going to miss the theme by having the characters sort of explain everything to you. But to me, where it really works, it's not just, the subjective voiceover, but, and this is something you talk about in a wonderful section on Sturgis, is the idea of a kind of cinematic use of sound, in the sense that there's a general assumption that whatever is visual is cinematic, and anytime it's dialogue or voiceover or sound is somehow less cinematic, but that there can be a way for even voiceover to be used in a cinematic way, where when it creates a kind of distinct kind of sound that becomes part of the atmosphere and the mood of the movie. And, that's what really works in something like Out of the Past or, Force of Evil, or something where the voiceover almost becomes like a score. It's really functioning almost in a musical way.
Yeah, this ties in again to this novelistic thrust, because once you have a voice either of a character displaced in time or a character's mind or a non-character narrator, you add a layer to the movie that can benefit the movie or not, obviously, depending on how it's used. But I think of how all these things tie together in films that we're showing actually at MoMI this weekend. For instance, Letter to Three Wives, which is kind of virtuoso in this respect, because there you've got a narrator who's a character but who's never seen.
Right.
And she's providing a whole different perspective on what you're seeing, as if she's watching the movie along with us. She's commenting on their gestures and things like this. Like, this is kind of crazy, but she's this kind of voice of God, but she's in the story world. She knows, what's going on. And that kind of playfulness is perfectly permissible as far as I'm concerned. Just stretching those conventions. And voiceover then becomes very useful. Or you think of somebody nowadays like Wong Kar-wai, he couldn't make a movie without voiceover, it seems to me. Because with him, that voice, that's the glue that holds the whole thing together. All these moments of powerful impressions, they need some sort of, flow, and that's what the voiceover gives them. So it becomes a kind of floating soundtrack that becomes quite rich poetically. But all these things, I think, are already emerging in the 40s. Now, one thing I should say, if anyone bothers to listen to this, is that much of what I'm saying is not absolutely unique to or original with the 40s. That what I'm trying to argue is that these things are kind of there piecemeal in Hollywood cinema before the 40s, but they get consolidated and then expanded and kind of go nuts and wild in the 40s. So for instance, we do find some few films with voiceovers in the 30s, and we find films with flashbacks and replays, and the very end of the 30s, you have some psychoanalytic dramas and things like that. But it's really in the 40s where there's so much money to be made and so many people striving to make, their own things, to do innovative cinema, that it becomes kind of a crushed together. It explodes, I guess I'd say.
Because these are the attempt to make cinema psychological. You can see that in early experimental films like The Smiling Madame Bidet,
absolutely,
for instance. And it's not like people just all of a sudden were like, "Hey, why don't we insert this thing?" It's like the form was developing, and obviously technology played a huge component of that, and having reliable sound and having So it is
cyclical almost, or
yeah.
a wave.
Yeah.
Something.
It's an interesting point, because you have something like Smiling Madame Bidet or Les Glaces à Trois Faces trying to be the subjective, but not even in the 20s and 30s would you have something really like Lady in the Lake.
Right.
I mean, Lady in the Lake is a good example. I'm not saying it's a great movie, but somebody had to make it.
Yes.
Somebody had to do that.
Try.
Well, another great example, and this actually is a film that is screening at MoMA, I think this coming Friday, a film from the early 30s, which of course you do cite in the book, but The Sin of Nora Moran, which
movie.
is one of the most incredibly ambitious and ahead of its time movies of the early 30s. Poverty Row, no big stars, but it has the most complex flashback structure, flashbacks within flashbacks. It keeps shifting.
It's almost all stock footage too.
The perspective keeps shifting between, one person's telling the story and then you're in somebody else's head, but it's unclear if these things are all kind of like one inside the other, or you're just kind of drifting around.
Did I just dream that?
And then there are
I'm
these
still in your dream.
fascinating flashbacks in which, so that this woman who's on death row is looking back on her life and how she got there. But in the flashbacks, she knows what's going to happen. And she's saying, well, if I don't go to the door, this, what's going to happen won't happen. And so it's not just a flashback. It's like her reliving her life. And the only other film I can think of that has something sort of like that is Repeat Performance, where again you have, and that is a 40s film where someone is going back, but having to relive her life, in an attempt to make it turn out differently. So it's this strange use of flashbacks.
There it's almost a fantasy premise, because she just magically gets transported back a year and lives her life again. Whereas with Nora Moran, as you say, we're plunged into these layers of awareness about the past and the future that seem like completely unrealistic. I mean, just how could you know all this stuff? No, you're right. That's a fascinating example, and a good example of how crazy you could be in a B film, because you just had to pump something out there. And there are others. I mean, The Life of Virgie Winters is a much more contained example, but there you do have almost a Citizen Kane structure of a dead man and a woman recalling what she knew of him and so on. So there are, other cases. It's just that in the 40s, these became higher on the menu. They were more on the agenda.
Is there anything you wanted to touch on? Because we should probably wrap up soon. Sadly, wraps up sooner.
The only thing I'd add is something Imogen already said, but it was really a discovery for me, which was the popularity of the idea of trying to convert almost any movie you made into a mystery. Mm-hmm. That to me is fascinating, because it really does suggest a kind of immediate response to the audience, that you have this explosion of interest in mystery and suspense in popular media of the 40s. It's not that it wasn't there before, but it really becomes acute then, and becomes more intellectually respectable then too, And then suddenly you have major filmmakers willing to make thriller material. I mean, Hitchcock is the prime case, but virtually every major director of the 40s, okay, Ford no, but Hawks no, but basically, at least the up-and-coming, the young, all try their hands at mysteries and thrillers. Not detective stories necessarily, but suspense films and psychological domestic thrillers, things like that. That was a real surprise to me, although in a way, in retrospect, it makes sense, because Letter to Three Wives is a mystery, or All About Eve is a mystery. I mean, there's a way in which that could be imbued into almost any of the genre formulas. Pursuit is a Western mystery, I mean, so there's a way in which this pervasiveness of mystery plotting, that was a real discovery, at least for me. I mean, it wasn't obvious to me.
And might I add that we all know that the big podcast boom began with Serial and other true crime podcasts.
Absolutely.
So it's obviously the and sort of the proliferation of those, the proliferation of the form, people trying out new things, like with
Making of a Murderer. I mean,
all these things. So it's like it's sort of like how they always say, like, pornography is where you can tell where the next new technology is going to be, because they're going to try it out for us. Let's say in terms of genre, this is what nascent creative forms like to go to sort of get their audiences hooked and thrilled and fascinated.
I won't go into details, but I do have this sort of vague and approximate theory that there are some genres that don't have strong plot premises to work with. I would say science fiction is one. Science fiction is really about the world that you create. But what story do you tell within that? Well, it's going to be an adventure story, a story of exploration, it's going to be a war story, or it's going to be a mystery like Blade Runner. I mean, it seems like there are certain genres that have narrative structure really built into them, like adventure and mystery, and others that are more like musicals have sort of a soft narrative structure built into them, and some that just are about world making. And you have to like find and when that happens, as with the boom of science fiction, then you get mystery and adventure plotting as the basis.
Well, and it's interesting that it seems like in the 40s, mystery became the kind of go-to way that you grab the audience. You have to do something that's going to grip the audience and make them, want to stay. And if you look at the 30s, it's a little bit more like a kind of vaudevillian sense of entertainment. Like, you just come out and go, let me entertain you. And it's going to be so funny and it's going to be so lively and it's everything you're going to just want to watch. And in the 40s, instead, it's like, what can you do, any kind of story to make the audience go, well, I have to stay because I want to find out what's going to happen or what did happen, or, you kind of posit every story as being, in some sense, a mystery or having some kind of element of suspense, mystery really is connected so much to the interest in psychology and the idea that as with sort of, in a sense, Daisy Kenyon is the sort of where the characters are unsolved mysteries, but in a lot of the films that have a very obvious kind of Freudian element, it's, what is the secret? What is the hidden thing in this character, the puzzle of personalities? So it all kind of fits together.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, sadly, we'll have to end it there, dear listener. But before we do, it would be great if we talked about a film that we've seen recently that we liked. I'll go first. I rewatched for the first time since I was a child, Lady in White, which is a very bizarre film from 1988. It's entirely self-funded by this first and last time director. It's sort of like a mix of, it's generally classified under horror, although it is really more like a drama, a historical drama where people die. It's not scary at all. It's just so it has like these elements of like Spielberg and then like goofy Italian grandparents slapstick and then child murders and then a like trying to deal with racism. And it's just very bizarre, but there are definitely like these moments. And again, you want to talk about, there's a framing device, like, it's a flashback film and we never flash back to the present. We just are left in the past. Okay, good enough. Good enough for the 40s, good enough for 1988. But it's there are moments. I'm not going to say that I'm a huge fan of it, but it is just like fascinating to watch. And there are just so many beautiful moments. And even though the sort of like the resolution is kind of hackneyed, it is very interesting that this guy was so compelled to tell this story. And I always, an interesting failure.
So I just saw Maigret Sets a Trap, which is the Jean Delannoy film that's just been re-released by Kino Lorber. It's Jean Gabin. It's 1958, I think. It's a very, very classical policier. Again, a sort of formula, one which I sometimes find can be sort of plotting, and it's about the police and their methods. But this is absolutely, just so beautiful. It's so beautifully done, and It's filmed on location in Paris, wonderful settings, wonderful kind of sense of street life and all these little details. And of course, it's Jean Gabin. And, you know, he's middle-aged, sort of overwhelmingly weary, and, you know, on the surface, it can seem like this kind of weary, you know, aging character. And his performance, you know, as always with Gabin, you know, it kind of looks like he's not doing anything, and yet he's doing everything. And there was this moment, I think it's the first scene where you see him at home with his wife, and she makes him a cup of coffee, and they're talking, and then he gets a phone call, and he goes into the other room, and he's talking on the phone about the case, and his wife comes in and brings him the coffee so he can keep drinking it. And he just, in the middle of this phone call, he just like gives her this little smile, and this kind of warmth comes out of his face, and it just seems to tell you everything about the entire history of this marriage and, you know, their relationship, just in this little throwaway moment. And, you know, to me, he is just the greatest film actor, pretty much. And the film itself kind of matches that sense of, it's not overtly trying to do anything new. It's very much following a format we all recognize, but it's just the craftsmanship of it and the care that went into it. I really enjoyed it. So
it's funny you mention that, because I went on a heist film binge recently, and I watched Touchez pas au Grisby, you know, where he just, how can you make it so fascinating to watch an old guy walk across a room, you know?
or brush his teeth, make the bed.
You know, or making his bed for his buddy, you know, all this stuff. You're going, this is fascinating. You can make a whole movie. Forget Jean Dillman. I mean, let's just follow this guy around. But I completely agree with you about Gabin, but I have not seen that Maigret film you mentioned. I need to see that. Well, if you talk about recent films in theaters, I saw, The Foreigner, which was just exactly what you would expect. It was interesting to see Jackie not doing many of the other Jackie things I expected. But I guess the film I saw most recently was the Leo McCarey, The Milky Way, with Harold Lloyd, because I'm doing some work on Criterion on a Harold Lloyd installment for our series. And I was really impressed this time. I hadn't seen it in many, many years, but impressed at how they managed to take what was essentially comedian-centered comedy with Lloyd as the central figure and build the whole sort of 30s comic situation around him with lots of other, Lionel Stander, you know, and all these other actors from the 30s. And he fitted in very well, and he played as a team player. He was not just the star, though he got his moments, certainly. He was the main character, but they could kind of build Adolphe Menjou, and all these other characters are filling out these roles. And it's McCarey, so you get a sense of a kind of loose flow. Everything is kind of, it feels like it's a little improvised and rolled along and completely ingratiating. And I went back and read Otis Ferguson, one of my heroes on this, and he got it completely. He said, well, you know, this is fine. This is the way movies can be. This is perfectly enjoyable to make a movie this way. Hollywood figured out how to do this at last, you know. And that was the one I guess it made the most impression on me recently.
Thank you both for coming. This was wonderful.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Film Comment Podcast, produced by Violet Lucca and Nicholas Rapold, and edited by Michael Odemark. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. Film Comment is a bi-monthly magazine published by the Film Society of Lincoln Center. Since 1962, Film Comment has featured in-depth reviews, critical analysis, and feature coverage of mainstream, art house, and avant-garde filmmaking from around the world. Visit us online at filmcomment.com/subscribe to purchase a digital or print subscription to the magazine. Film Comment, at the heart of film culture for over 50 years.